Speaker, South Africa has been one of the greatest victims of colonialization and racial segregation by which the world has ever seen. Yet the reality of the current situation of South Africa indicates that in many ways, these awful atrocities have never left. We think it is imperative that we distribute land, the most important source of fixed capital that existed in South Africa, back to the black South Africans that it was stolen from, so that they can finally begin to regain both their country, their identity, and receive the rightful reparations by which they are deserved. We begin with framework and then a point on both principle and economics. Firstly, on framework. We think that often this land in discussion is rented out by corporations or owned by wealthy white farmers. We think this is a land that should be prioritized in our model. We think, in other words, we should focus on trying to seize things like large corporate farms, large farms in general, mineral deposits / mining factories, and avoid homes if possible. But if we must take sort of wealthy owners' homes, we will do so. Additionally, this is a progressive model on both fronts. In other words, it is progressive that we prioritize wealthy landowners to take land from, and then we simultaneously will prioritize the poorest of black South Africans to redistribute said land to. If you have any questions on the model, please ask now. I think it's relatively simple. Okay. First, let's discuss the principle, in that we think black South Africans have both a right to their identity in their country, as well as are owed this land. Firstly, we think that they have a right to identity because the South Africa is, above all, an African nation, obviously, right? So black South Africans the fact that they own less than 50% of this land is an undermining and a fundamental insult to this notion. What it means in practicality is that apartheid has never ended and colonialization has never left. We think this is egregious and we must address it. But most importantly, how have white South Africans gotten this money? Has it been through fair exchange of the market? I think we know the answer. What has happened in reality is that they have maintained this wealth and maintained this oppression by the thieving of fixed capital that began with colonialization. But more importantly, since then, they have continued to keep black South Africans down in a way by which they have no recourse to regain said land. Firstly, if they are unwilling to give up the land, then there is no way for which poor South Africans can access it. But additionally, poor South Africans have been kept in those situations by apartheid. They were kept in the underclass so that they had a lack of both access to education as well as access to capital. This means black South Africans have been unable to access the land in and of itself, but also unable to open up businesses or make economic innovations such that they could ever access this land, which again we tell you is probably the most important fixed capital asset that exists within a country, especially a smaller one such as South Africa. Your question closing.
Yeah, Mugabe did this in Zimbabwe, now everyone's in poverty. Is that a meaningful reparation?
So firstly, I think it is very possible, especially given our model, which I think was a little more nuanced, is that we are able to do this in a way which will not inflict the economy, but additionally, as I told you, my second point will be on why we think this is actually will give an economic boom to South Africa. Additionally, most importantly, we say they are owed this land because of 4 reasons. As mentioned, firstly, it was taken from them in the first place. Thus, we think, even if this goes down a few generations, ultimately, they are deserved it as sort of right to property that they should have had originally were it not for these egregious atrocities. Secondly, as I stated, they have been kept down ever since, and this is the only reasonable means of recourse. And this will be discussed in more detail in the economic argument, in which we tell you, if you have no access to capital, you have no means by which to regain the very wealth that has been stolen from you, the very land which has been stolen from you. Third, most important, very importantly, I think that reparations must be commensurate with the level of suffering that has been inflicted. When you consider the sort of scale, both in timeline as well as magnitude in which colonialization and apartheid occurred in South Africa, I think it becomes clear that reparations must be on a similar scale. If we do not do something radical as opening government is proposing to you, then reparations lose their meaning. They are not significant in that you are refusing to be commensurate with the suffering originally imposed and continue to be imposed for the last hundreds of years. Fourth and finally, we think what this does is it fosters income inequality, both in general in the nation of South Africa, which suffers from this severely, and very importantly, it addresses income inequality that exists currently across racial lines. We now move on to our second argument about economics and why we think this will actually help the South African economy. 2 points of background first. 90% of the wealth in South Africa is owned in white landowners. This is because of the businesses they own, as well as sort of the worth of the land in and of itself. The point is that almost none of this goes to the people for two reasons. A lot of it flows outside of the country because so much of this is through international corporations as well as foreign landowners. But additionally, it's the simple fact that income inequality is inevitably a snowball process, in that rich people have a significantly lower marginal propensity to spend, which means as these wealthy landowners continue to earn money off this stolen land, they hold it on. They are unwilling to spend it in the way that Black South Africans or low-income South Africans in general would spend it and need to spend it. So it ends up being stuck in the top. But second point of background is that both farms and mineral deposits that we would prioritize mentioned in the model represent very stable sources of long-term income, and this is significant. We will get into that here. Because why is an influx of wealth in this specific manner we discuss a good thing? We have 3 points under this. Firstly, we think that it represents stable income that is far different from standard forms of reparation. Because what this stability does is it allows Black South Africans to take risks in ways that they have been denied over the last century. Specifically, this means taking loans and starting businesses. We think these things are undeniably good for the economy as well as the people themselves. This is a very significant impact. Secondly, we think it elongates the good of reparations, especially relative to a cash reparation. Because ultimately, in the long term, in order to have significant both improvement of status as well as improvement of the economy as an entirety, capital is needed. When that capital is constrained to this top class of white landowners, then you will never have this type of stimulation. Third and finally, the fact that this represents recurring assets via dividends and continuous streams of revenue is important because that money will be ultimately put back into the economy, which is the best way to stimulate growth. This means we increase the velocity of money as well as allow more businesses to crop up as money is more rapidly transitioning between people. This is because of what I mentioned earlier, that the marginal propensity to spend is significantly higher among those who will be distributed this land. They will thus be putting the money they receive via these reparations back into the economy. We will have significant growth via the treaties we mentioned before, as well as this. Mr. Speaker, I think it is pivotal that we finally give South Africa back to those who it was originally owed. We end the reality that apartheid is still here and colonialism has never left. We are proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open up the case for the op bench.
I think the Gov identifies a real and important social problem, but their solution is a battering ram that does more harm than good. First point is we think that the seizure of assets is a radical economic move, has devastating consequences for the South African economy and everybody who lives in South Africa. Why is this? First of all, we think it is terrible for both foreign and domestic investment. We think that in a world in which assets are being seized and the people who have the wealth can't invest, that are afraid to invest that wealth, they will not be in a position to, they will not do it, and they will not be able to advance South African economic interests. So they talk a lot about minerals, for example. Mines need capital investments and continued inflows of capital in order to extract that revenue and in order to make a difference. We think that in a world in which people are uncertain about the property regime, think that these programs could change or expand at any time. There will always be pressure to invest elsewhere rather than in South Africa. South Africa is not the only place in the world to find minerals, and they will go elsewhere with more stable property rights regimes. Businesses will be convinced that other countries will try to woo businesses that were formerly located in South Africa with the promise of more stability and a better economic regime. We think that this is devastating because it means that it reduces economic growth and it also reduces employment, which particularly affects people who do not have a safety cushion on which to operate. So we think that this disproportionately affects people who are living paycheck to paycheck, and we think that this sort of capital flight will prevent the future growth of South Africa that will benefit all South Africans. We think that minerals are particularly important in this context as well, but we also think that this applies to farmland, where we think that automation and the ability to extract more revenue from particular bits of farmland are necessary for a farm to maintain its competitiveness, and we think that only on our side of the house is that possible. I'll take that now.
Yes, so considering that this isn't just an arbitrary move and it's based on a principle and a justification by the state, why is it that all investors are going to be uncertain about the nature of the property regime, especially considering that they don't fit this particular justification or standard for the property being taken away?
I mean, I think investors do. I think that the model specifically identifies that these sorts of cases, and the fact that white South Africans and large multinational corporation owned lands would be the ones targeted. I don't think that people are just going to say, oh, this is the end. There's no reason why this would be the only such seizure of land. If such things become part of the politics of South Africa, whenever a government is flagging, it could be something that they do in order to retain their popularity. I don't think that that this is going to be seen by the investment community as a one-off, one-and-done deal. But now let's talk about the efficiency. I don't think this benefits the average South African in any meaningful way. In fact, it may seriously harm them. So first, let's talk about the principle of redistributing land as a means of redistributing wealth. So we think that in empirical examples, this just hasn't worked out that well. Batcalf gives you the example of Mugabe. We think that we can look at the United States. We can see that Georgia conducted a land lottery in the 1800s. 50 years later, the recipients of the land were no better off than the ones who lost the land lottery. Why is this? First of all, we think that wealthy South Africans still have a ton of money and are in a position to buy back land at incredibly cheap rates. There's now going to be a lot of people without much capital but with a lot of land. There's a very clear economic exchange to be made. That will be made quickly, and it will not do much for South Africans. We also think that there's not necessarily the experience and the ability among people who just receive land to use that land effectively and to develop it as effectively as they could otherwise be developed. We think on our side of the house, we can support programs that redistribute wealth, redistribute opportunity, and encourage people to, and perhaps even subsidize the purchase of land by people who are willing and able to use that land effectively. We don't think this radical redistribution program is something that we can support. We also think that it's important to consider the corruption of the South African government. We think that they tell you that they will target this in a progressive way. We argue that that is never what happens. We think that on our side of the house, you create a further marginalized caste of people without access to the government, and now without access to land, and without even the demand for reparations or socioeconomic equality to sustain their push. We think that this is worse marginalization for the worst group in South African society, which is something you ought to privilege if you're capitalist. Finally, in this point, I think we should consider urbanization. We on our side of the house, we think urbanization is the best strategy for South Africans to improve their standard of living in the long run. We think that this increases the possibility for innovation, increases the ability to gain social status, education, access to facilities like that may not be present in rural areas, like electrification, sanitation, medical care. And so we think it is important to encourage people to move to the cities rather than tying up South Africans' wealth in specific land that needs to be farmed and maintained. We think that this forces ruralization upon the population, which we do not think is a productive strategy. On our side of the house, measures that redistribute wealth and opportunity directly rather than tying it to the land are more effective. We think it's the opening government's claim that it's better to have this in the long run doesn't make much sense in the context of the alternative programs that really exist. Because as long as those things are continue in political society, there is no reason why they wouldn't continue in the long run as well. So we don't think that argument justifies redistributing land over just redistributing resources directly or redistributing opportunity. Now, finally, I want to talk about the political consequences. We think this undoes all the work of truth and reconciliation commissions and radically repolarizes South African politics. We do not think that it's not great, obviously, that black South Africans have to work within a system in which white South Africans have a huge amount of capital. Can I use your time right now? Have to work in a system with white South African controlled capital, social and economic. But we think that is still what happens after the decision to reallocate land is made. We think that most resources and most wealth is not actually tied up in the land, but is financial assets. And we think that there's going to be a huge amount of social capital that is now being used adversarially in a racial politics that is deeply, deeply adversarial. On our side of the house, we prevent that by not taking away land in such an abrupt and oppositional system. They say that there is a right to that land. We don't think that is how it will be seen as a decision. We think on our side of the house it is likely to be seen as land taken away for something that these people personally never did. And we think that while that they may have moral answers to that, they don't have political answers to it. On our side of the house, we have a politics that is not geared around that racial opposition and will be more capable of developing constructive solutions to social problems in the long run. We think that bitter divide and self-interest alienates both sides, can lead to violence, and we also think more broadly it discredits the truth and reconciliation mechanism, which is an impact that spills over outside South Africa. We think the importance of the truth and reconciliation model is that it entirely gives up on the need for recrimination and stays above that. We think that's particularly important for societies that are just recovering from conflicts and are considering how to address those problems, because those societies are even more fragile and are more prone to violence and conflict. The model of South Africa demonstrates, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions didn't do anything and then we just went on to seize land radically. We think that societies are less likely to adopt that model and are more likely to jump straight to violence. We think on our side of the house we preserve a model in which politics can go from adversarial to constructive and it develop real solutions rather than just a knee-jerk response to an important social problem. Very proud to oppose.
I think the leader of opposition for that speech, and now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
What they didn't do in that speech is address any of the principled claims that Black South Africans have to this land in their country. It is outside a consideration of actual success of these reparations in causing any sort of economic benefit to Black South Africans or South Africa writ large that this land is owed to this people because of the harms that have been visited upon them. I'm going to revisit some of the warrants that Dennis gave you because they were fundamentally unanswered by that opposition speaker. The first reason he gave you is that this is above all an identification of your nationhood, right? Or this is how you identify your nationhood. It is completely implausible to realize that despite over 50% of this country being black, that they own less than 30% of the land, that it's incommensurate, that they need to have some sort of ability to engage with their nation through the use of capital, since that is the most physical notion of that nation. But more than that, though, Dennis told you that this capital, this land, which is the most physical manifestation of capital, has been acquired unjustly. They didn't respond to this, right? Just the fact that it has been acquired unjustly, that it was stolen from these individuals, requires that it be returned to them at some point by any notion of justice. It is outside a consideration of whether or not they can use the land properly, as Ovo wants to tell you, or whether this is a meaningful reparation, as CG might want to tell you, or CO might want to tell you later, because this land is owed to these people regardless. More than that, though, we think that this actually does provide economic benefit. So there's a principled reason here that they need to answer if they want to win this debate. But outside of that, we actually think this has significant economic benefits. They didn't actually respond to a lot of the warrants that Dennis gave you as to why this is true. Before I go, I'll take CO.
Yeah, so let's say you have this watch and I take it, but it turns out that the watch is carcinogenic, and if I give it back to you, you die of cancer. Do I have an obligation to give it back just because I took it?
You didn't take it from me because it was giving me cancer. You took it from me because you wanted it, and you took it because I was powerless to stop you. That is the reason why it is owed back to me. It is patronizing for you to say that I know that this is bad for you and that I refuse to give it back to you. It is still mine to begin with, and the motive behind it wasn't this altruistic bullshit that you just spewed. Okay, second of all, on economic benefits, right? We say that in the status quo, capital doesn't go to the poor. Why? Because some of it goes international, but moreover, capital begets capital. That is, to get more capital, I have to have a lot of base capital in order to expand. Why is this true? One, because I need to be able to invest and have some sort of ability to post collateral for loans. Two, I need to be able to start my own, I have to be able to be an entrepreneur, start my own business. Have all of these things and access education, which requires all this capital. Why does this not happen in the status quo? Because all of the people who own capital are these white, rich landowners who, despite what opposition might want you to believe, are clearly racially motivated in keeping Black South Africans kept out of the system where they can access this capital. This means that when we provide it directly to them, they finally have the ability to access these systems. They finally have the startup capital to begin all of the things that I told you. Why is capital, I already told you why capital is so important. Just the fact that you are allowed to now invest in education, that you now get this constant stream of income. Because, okay, so the kind of response we got out of this from OO was that they're going to get the land, and all the corporations that were previously renting this land are just not going to rent them anymore. We think this is infeasible, right? Corporations are still going to rent out that land. They're just going to give that money to black individuals instead of white individuals. That income is better spent in the hands of black individuals because it hastens the decrease of income inequality and for all the principled reasons that we gave you before. But secondly, though, even if they don't get the income, they still have the capital, which means that even if white landowners want to buy this land back, they can post it for a premium and get a lot more money. At the end of the day, this is they get more money to actually spend regardless. But we think that they're going to get all of this income and the capital as well. So why is income inequality bad for economic reasons, right? First of all, that the marginal propensity to spend at the top of the income scale is very low. That means these white landowners, when they get an extra dollar, spend 10 cents of it. But when a black landowner who was previously poor suddenly gets all this capital and has all this income, he or she is finally able to invest in the things that they would otherwise be unable to. So they're going to spend 90% of this on things like education, things like buying like clothes and food, and things that are other necessities for them to actually access the systems from which they have been precluded before. Okay. Second of all, what is it? So this, like, as a whole, means that the economy is going to, I'll like cross-reference this somewhat with some of the responses that we got out of OO. So the first thing they said is that this is bad for foreign and domestic investment because people are going to be unsure of what's going to be happening next, and therefore they're going to be too scared to invest. A few responses. One, this is done for a very principled reason, for all of the reasons that Dennis gave you and you ignored. But second of all, because this was done for a principled reason, it's presumably not going to be done again, which means there is no kind of hesitance as to what's going to be done in the future. This doesn't scare off foreign or domestic capital. Third of all, though, that this capital is now in the hands of black individuals. So these investments are still made. They're just made by black individuals, so they can then reap the benefits of those investments. We much prefer that world on our side of the house. The only kind of response we got out of this is that these black individuals have no idea what to do with this capital. First of all, we think this is an overgeneralization and kind of like really harmful as like a conception to begin with. But second of all, we think they can learn, right? Like these people are able to like get education for themselves by going to school and finally paying for that. Okay. The second thing that they gave us on, like, in terms of response is these sort of empirical examples that wealthy South Africans now have the money to buy back land. Already told you why that's not going to be, or why that's not going to be relevant. But second of all, they told you that the corruption of the South African government is going to prevent this from ever being efficacious. Okay, I think we have some fiat power in OG. We told you that this is going to happen in a progressive manner. It's going to happen in a progressive manner. These model quibbles. Okay. Third of all, they told you that urbanization is the best strategy for development and we need to draw people to the city in the long run. A couple of things here. One, the reason why I don't uproot my life in the rural areas and move to the city is because I don't have the financial capital and financial safety and safety net to actually like back my moving to the city. When I have that safety net, when I'm finally able to invest the money to help me buy an apartment or a condo in the city, then I'm actually going to go and do that, right? This gives them the ability to do that by giving them that stable financial backing. Note that this is different than just a cash reparation, which is what we think like CEO is probably going to run on this, but because this land pays increasing dividends ad infinitum, right? Like they're able to get all of this income from this land by renting it out to like all of these corporations and like to actually operate the mines that these exist on. The last thing to talk about is political consequences, which is really just a fancy word for backlash, right? First of all, backlash is short term, right? This gets solved in the long run because we give more political power to Africans within this country. Why is that true? One, now they have the time and the safety, the financial safety to be politically active. Second of all, they can now invest in education. So the next generation of Africans now goes into government more than they did before. And the third is campaign spending. So they're finally able to achieve government. The kind of political stability that you have on your side is a false political stability. It's one where white people have dominated and we're tired of it. We're incredibly proud of
I think that the speech you have called on is really the opposition.
Everybody ready? Opening governments does in fact say the word principle, but they don't go much farther than that. We have a few responses to the idea that just because they try to have some sort of non-consequentialist justification for a policy, that it is okay for them to suggest that South Africa literally has a moral obligation to make black people living in that country worse off. We don't think that you get to take marginalized populations and make them a pawn in a moral game, right? We think that individual lives matter substantially more, right, than abstract moral principles, right? But we think, though, that any moral principle is necessarily derived from the fact that we don't like being harmed, and we like having good things, and we like not killing the political mobility for actual structural reparations in South Africa. So we think that it's going to be very problematic to try to consider a lot of OG's argument because they ask you to frame it in a way that is solely principled. But remember, the only principle that the South African government ought to be considering, or the only thing we ought to ask the South African government to consider in this case, is whether or not it actually fulfills its direct obligations to do good by its citizens. Now, in some on-case refutation from what the opening government tries to tell you about, right? So, first of all it is talking about principle. The only principle that they have remaining that is non-consequential is whether you identify with nationhood. They tell you that the only way that you can be a citizen or part of a polity is by literally owning some of the land. We don't think it's true. We think political citizenship still occurs. We think that receiving benefits from a government still occurs. We think there's still fundamental ways to engage with the government, right? When you're not, when you don't end up in this program. The next thing that we tell you about is that there's a severe tangle in the principle they try to give you. Consider the principle, right? They tell you first that people ought to have this property because they don't have it in the status quo, or they tell you that they ought to have this property because it was taken from them previously. So the second justification is out, right? That we want to lift more people out of poverty. We think that insofar as they tell you this justification, you ought to buy it to some degree. It also trades off against the justification that we ought to only give property to the direct descendants of previous landowners, which would be people who were poor in the pre-colonial status quo, entirely out of the picture anyway, which means they're again not solving for the most severely marginalized populations who are weak, who are the people whom we care about in the opening opposition. Now the last thing they try to talk to you about, in order to be comparative to the great analysis that the leader of the opposition gives you, is their economic warranty. So the first thing they talk to you about is about the need for collateral to acquire a loan. But what's contained in this argument, though, is that there's a greater incentive to acquire cash than to acquire land. We think that this means, really importantly, and they don't deal with this argument, about why buybacks happen. Buybacks empirically happen in cases where there's still capital accumulation as opposed to land accumulation. They tell you, capital matters a ton, right? They tell you that their only response to why capital accumulates without land buybacks is that corporations are now going to offer to rent. We don't think that they make this offer. We think that when you're an individual who, as they tell you, is probably going to be the poorest substratum of South Africa, this means that you are not, that first of all, you probably don't have an accountant who you can go send to negotiate with a large mining or multinational farming corporation, but it also means that you're likelier to take a large sum of money and spend it in ways directly related, right, to sustenance. But we think that means that it's far less likely to be generational. I'll take close one.
Thank you very much. So a large part of your case is premised on the fact that these people just don't know how to use this particular money and they have no incentive to do so. But what about Black South Africans who are farmers and who need more land to be able to help the agricultural industry within South Africa?
Sure. So we tell you a couple of things, right? First, we tell you there's less of a likelihood to invest in things like mechanization, which means that criminal black workers are less likely to be competitive. The next thing we tell you, though, is there are organizational incentives and just in asymmetries of information, so that there's still more investment and more involvement directly in agricultural and mining sectors in South Africa that these multinational corporations have. They're able to directly trade off with the resources, with the limited resources of the poor South Africans, including farmers, right? So now, even if they understand, right, even if they understand their individual employment perspective on the way that on their work, we think that there's a substantial difference between corporate finance and farming. Right? We don't think that's a massive radical jump. We tell you that this creates a short-term boom, especially as more people start encountering really large amounts of wealth from achieving sale. We can look, for example, to the Soviet Union, how people could have prioritized long-term incentives and taken the voucher shares they were given during the dissolution of the Soviet Union and state-owned enterprises. Instead, they sold them because they had to focus on a short-term incentive. What's the next thing that they tell you about? They tell you about long-term good. We tell you the only way to actually achieve long-term good is by creating structural governmental reforms, specifically the creation of a larger, more means-tested welfare program. We think that this is what we support on side opening opposition. We tell you that the better way to get reparations is to have active, race-conscious government programs that are first provided by the government. In their world, they want the private sector to solve for a problem that is fundamentally social. We don't think that that's how it works. We think that once you put property back onto the open market, and we are almost certain that it does go back once you have ownership and it becomes a chance to acquire a certain amount of cash in a single generation, we think that this means it is going to be very difficult, right, for these people to actually access governmental reform. Even if they access some cash, they probably don't spend it on political organization, right? But now go to what we tell you in opening opposition with a few more answers. First, they don't tell you why buybacks don't happen. They tell you rent possibly happens. They tell you this just isn't the offer that gets made. All of the negotiating power and all of the capital still remains with the corporations, who will decide not to pay rents. They could probably take a very brief hit, but if you're the individual who owns this land and now has to pay property taxes on it, this means that it's actually more expensive to own land now because you're paying property taxes to the South African government based on the value of this land when it was owned by a highly functioning multinational corporation. This means you have a really high tax rate, which means there's a tremendous short-term incentive to sell before it impacts your own direct bottom line, because you can't afford to hold out for 2 months against the multinational corporations because because they can wait for a couple months while prices go down, and there's this massive land glut of everybody selling, and just wait to not pay you rent while everybody else begins to sell. That means that the people who receive this land sell eventually. Next, they try to answer corruption, and we tell you it's a model. And we think it's really important to understand, right, the type of corruption that exists in South African politics, whether it's non-cooperation with the International Criminal Court, collusion with mining unions. We think the Zuma government, even if they're giving it to the poorest people, they're only giving it, right, to supporters of African National Congress, President Zuma's party, right? We think that this means this creates a political patronage system, right, which creates again a subcaste of people who are political outsiders in the status quo. We think that this is deeply problematic insofar as it creates yet another rift and yet another inequality in South African politics. Also, that we tell you that this creates just a norm of large-scale land acquisition by the South African government that first is going to scare off foreign investors. I think foreign investors don't see one reckless policy and assume, oh, they've just done one reckless policy as opposed to zero. That's not bad. We see now this government is doing reckless policies, a terrible place to invest because we will never see the returns on that investment, right? So corporations wait for people to feel a financial strain of taxation. They buy the land. This kills any political mobility for reparations, but more importantly, it kills international political mobility for truth and reconciliation. We tell you that after apartheid, after a conflict, it is good that South Africa did not immediately seek redistribution, but rather sought understanding. We tell you that other post-conflict societies should follow this model and not the radical policy that harms the poorest South Africans brought to you by South government today. So proud to oppose.
The speech now call upon member of government to open up case for the closing government that half of this debate.
When over 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by white South Africans and they have 90% of the wealth, and 80% of black South Africans do not currently own land, when a large proportion of the HIV AIDS epidemic is caused by high-density problems within those particular geographically and racially segregated areas, we believe that is largely insufficient, the line that we get out of open opposition. Two lines of argumentation in this debate. The correct principle that ought to be run in this round, and secondly, how economics is better. All refutation will come at the bottom and some of it will be interwoven within. OG gives us a generic principle that seeks to explain an identity-based claim. This principle dances around the issue because it doesn't address the relationship between the government and the South Africans within the black South Africans in the status quo. That is to say, they want to talk about generic claims about how these individuals have a principal claim to this land because it is their identity, without first establishing why that's true, or secondly, establishing why this is a necessary means for recourse. What are we going to do? Our principle addresses the root cause of this issue because we believe the state has a vested interest in trying to establish equality, and if they don't have a vested interest, they should. Why is this the case? One, because of the rhetoric of the rainbow democracy and its perception in the international sphere. Secondly, because of the recognition that the lottery of birth means that people's lives are pretty shitty, especially when the government has created that shittiness for a large proportion of the society. We believe the government ought to create policies and institutions that benefit the most disadvantaged in society, especially when the government has created that disadvantage. How do we know the South African society is far from the ideal of equality in the ways the South African government created this disadvantage? This goes far beyond the generic claims that we get out of opening government. Fourfold. Firstly, because of colonization and the plunder of land. That is literally, it was forcefully taken from them and they haven't shown us how this was done. Why is this the case and how do we know this? It's because these individuals literally killed them by brute force and murder. Secondly, on a more particularized notion, the district and the exonement. This means that the increased propensity of HIV and AIDS is increased on our side of the house is because of the racial segregation that has been put in place by the South African African government. Thirdly, because of Bantu laws that made mobilization virtually impossible because education was literally shut out from these people. That's to say, if you were a black or colored person, you could not go get any education. To the extent that that's the case, there's literally a lost generation of black Africans in South Africa. Fourthly, because of promoting gear policies over RDB policies in the 1994 post-apartheid regime. That's to say, gear policies always prioritize neoliberal policies over the redistributive policies that were actively sought with Mandela. That's to say, the concessions that were made in 1994 with these neoliberal policies mean that it's so much harder for these individuals to push past this. Why is this important? One, because this argument prioritizes the right actor that we should be focusing in this debate. That is to say, to the extent that we have any a priori claims in this debate, we're showing you how we're winning this because these individuals have literally have had their disadvantage manufactured. Secondly, we say that we create better policies in the long term. Why is this the case? Not right now, Danny. Because firstly, it creates consistency and a precedent. That is to say, to the extent that we have a precedent and a principal claim on how we function with our property-based democracy, we believe that this does it. Secondly, black South Africans are more empowered, have a better recourse with the state. To the extent that this is the case, we're looking at the principle and how this principle looks for an individual. To the extent that we ought prioritize any principle, we believe that we ought prioritize a principle that garners most recourse for the individuals who are most disadvantaged. To the extent that we prioritize this principle, we believe that black South Africans feel empowered and they have a better vertical relationship with the state Second line of argumentation. Before I do that, go ahead.
Yeah, so your argument is that the government has done a wide variety of awful things to black people in South Africa. But that means that, you can't undo every single one of those policies. So why, instead of just giving land for a principal reason, shouldn't we just try to have the government on a policy level meaningfully improve the lives of its citizens?
This isn't mutually exclusive. We believe that this policy is a necessary step in the right direction because then it allows us to have more recourse because these individuals have a principle-based claim for how we ought move in the future. So I don't understand the function of that question. Second line of argumentation, but before I get into that, a couple of points that was alluded to in closing oppositions. Earlier POI, they talk about Mugabe's claim in Zimbabwe. First of all, this is a dictatorship, so it's not analogous because South Africa is a democracy. Secondly, patrimonialism and client-based relationships mean that it was always prioritized to the extent that they want to make an analogous claim that it doesn't matter between a democracy and a dictatorship. We believe that the client-based relationships in that government always supersede that. That is to say, there's no recourse in those situations, so it doesn't make sense that they would even bring that up. Second line of argumentation on the economics of this. So currently the wealth disparity is hurting the economy because of firstly a lack of capital flowing and the purchasing power for these individuals. That is to say these individuals can't participate in the government. Secondly, because commercial agriculture is prioritized over small scale farming, and this should be what we prioritize, especially when it gives black Africans recourse in the state. How do we change this? Firstly, because we take land from the most wealthy individuals, and now small farmers can own land to farm without having to compete with commercial farmers. Secondly, small-scale farming helps because it localizes production of food and it makes easier distribution because of the lower prices that happen. That is to say, when I'm selling in a more small-scale and localized issue, that will always benefit my community first and foremost. Second of all, on their side of the house, when you prioritize commercial development and commercial farming, they always prioritize profit incentives, so the cost of these goods is always going to be higher on their side. We believe that it's net beneficial for the individuals who have been marginalized for us to have small-scale farming. Thirdly, it gives other individuals a chance to create small business. That is to say, CFOG's analysis, they were right in some instances when they say that you need some form of collateral. What are the impacts of this? Twofold actually. Firstly, it decreases the wealth disparity because it saves lives and it allows these individuals to have some recourse within the state because now they can produce and have consumption levels. Secondly, the economic growth. That is to say, we believe that inequality is decreased, and the decrease of inequality allows for these individuals to participate in the society, which drives economic growth for the state overall. This isn't only about black South Africans, it's about the legitimacy and the consistency of the economic growth within that state. For those reasons, powerful.
Great, I think the member of government for the speech, and now call upon the member
South Africa is one of the only settler colonies in Africa not to see a civil war upon the end of colonialism. Didn't happen in Algeria, didn't happen in Kenya, didn't happen in Zimbabwe, but some kind of fragile peace happened in South Africa. That was not inevitability, ladies and gentlemen. That was the result of a fragile social fabric stitched together by Mandela and F.W. de Klerk in the early 1990s. It's a fabric that will be destroyed by this policy. We're going to move beyond the adversarial racial politics that Owen wants to talk about, explain systemically the roots of what race and politics looks like and means in South Africa, explain why this policy is likely to lead to violence and conflict, and then do a bit more economic analysis to explain why we don't win on that issue too. Those are going to be the two forces of our extension. After that, I'll do a little bit of rebuttal to what we hear particularly out of CG, but out of OG as well. So let's talk a bit about violence. So, following apartheid, the political accord reached between the ANC, the white South Africans, promised essentially the ANC would not be like other post-colonial governments in Africa. They would govern democratically, they would govern in a non-corrupt manner, and most importantly, they create the kind of rainbow nation which meant that there was a meaningful place for white South Africans within South African society, as well as black South Africans. They move away from the retributive punishment that we saw in the case of Mugabe, in the case of Idi Amin in Uganda. And that's crucial. The idea that there is a place for white South Africans within this society. There are three ways in which this fragile accord is totally destroyed by this policy and likely, therefore, to lead to violence. The first of which is that it undoes the basic notion the ANC is a democratic party. What's the political context we're dealing with in South Africa right now? The Democratic Alliance, which is a predominantly white-backed but also supported by lots of black South African party, is on the upswing. It's won a number of important regional elections in the past year. They're likely to be, probably the party that wins the next election because they've seen substantial bit of support from black South Africans disaffected by the bad economic management we see now in Jacob Zuma and the ANC more generally. The ANC, meanwhile, is racked by corruption. Zuma barely survives voter no confidence, just hanging on by the edge of its fingertips. It's also seen a split on the left from a group called the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, who don't support radical redistribution. But even they don't support this policy because they recognise it's such a terrible idea. What does all of this mean? In this context, this looks like a political move by Zuma to buy the votes of black South Africans who are moving away from his party because they recognise that economic mismanagement is failing. This looks like a subversion of democracy. This looks like a move to vote buying and the kind of electoral authoritarianism that modern dictatorship in Africa looks like. It's the model used by Museveni in Uganda, used by Kenyatta in Kenya, used by Kagame in Rwanda. This is a thing that people know works, and white South Africans are going to be terrified this is a move towards permanent rule by the ANC and erosion of democracy. They see it's no longer possible for them to compete democratically, that's likely to lead to violence. That's the first reason. Secondly, then, we just want to look at what this looks like actually on the ground. Because they want to claim this is exclusively like Iowa-style big corporate farms that we're dealing with lots of tractors. That's just not the reality, right? If you're talking about corporate farms, you mean corporate farms where there are substantial, white, usually Afrikaner families living on these lands actually managing them. In addition, like farming is just far, far less corporatized in South Africa than it is across a lot of the rest of the world. Often it is admittedly large, but like family farms farms owned by Afrikaners. What does that mean? This is the South African government, as we've already established, now looks incredibly corrupt and anti-democratic, going into these farms, saying to a white Afrikaner who's very heavily armed, who has survived like MK and apartheid and all of that, is also probably like reasonably racist, that we are going to take your land from you. We think this is just a tinderbox for incredible localized conflict around the country. Right? Lots of will have just Clive and Bundy, only 100 times worse, and around the entire country. If you want to talk about stoking violence, this is incredibly awful. A third thing to note in terms of violence is that we are just living in the context of the highest racial tensions that we've seen in South Africa since the end of apartheid. This means things like the Rose Must Fall movement, the Fees Must Fall movement, literally promoting violent riots within universities in South Africa, literally breaking into parliament and violently threatening MPs until they voted on a bill to strike down large numbers of tuition fees. Right now, the racial tensions that previously existed only in older generations in South Africa have been passed down to younger generations too, and particularly students. It means particularly right now, this is a time where small fires around the country can ignite violence across all of it. What does this mean overall? The best case scenario, therefore, is this is accompanied by large-scale riots and social upheaval. This just means a lot of people die, which we think is just a bad thing in general. No one's really talked about those kind of consequences. Also, if you want to talk about like, economic terms, it will probably also destroy capital. It will probably also just cause rich people, both rich black South Africans and rich white South Africans, just to leave and take their capital with them, cause investors to refuse to invest in places they see as structurally violent and unstable. Even more likely, though, is far, far more widespread conflict. Because note, the importance of the Mugabe counterfactual isn't necessarily that it's true or a perfect analogy. Rather, it's the fear that white South Africans have. They see necessarily that what happened in Zimbabwe is white people in Zimbabwe saw their land taken, thought, okay, we can still work with this society, we can still survive, saw that didn't happen. They're going to be terrified of the same thing happening, and therefore going to make even more in it. Like to see structural and widespread violence as a result of this policy. It's pretty awful. No thanks. Let's talk about the economics now then. So, the important thing to know about the economics, no one's touched on this in this debate yet, is the tax base of South Africa is already on the verge of collapse. South Africa is incredibly near a recession. They're struggling to even fund basic provision of public services and schools. We will push them over the brink for 3 reasons. Firstly, look, if you seize an asset, and that asset is in any sense less managed, less well managed than it is under the status quo, is inevitably likely, given these people just be less experienced, the value of the asset falls. Therefore, just the value of capital in South Africa you're able to tax falls commensurately. Secondly, though, simultaneously, these large corporations that you've given out are far, far more easy to tax than like individual black South Africans who are doing like small-scale farming that's not making a huge amount of money, as CG was saying, rather than like corporations which are very easy to tax at a far, far higher level. That just means you just generally get less money than you would otherwise. Thirdly, most importantly though, Zuma will not want to tax his political base, particularly given all the electoral calculus mechanisms we gave you earlier in this debate, because they then, even if they become the centre of the economy, this means the alternative is printing money in inflation, exactly what happened in Zimbabwe, exactly the thing that's likely to lead to awful outcomes. Take a closer.
Yes, thank you very much. So, does a democracy not have a vested interest in producing equality?
Sure, so I'm going to get on to that point. Actually, let's just go on straight now. So, reparations, deal with OG later. What do we hear out of CG first? They say it's important to establish equality. Note this is an outcomes-based claim. They claim it is important to, quote, benefit the most disadvantaged within South Africa. Insofar as that happens then, the question of this debate is whether this policy hurts or benefits the most disadvantaged within South Africa. I've given you 5 minutes of analysis. We've heard analysis down the bench about why this is likely to harm those disadvantaged within South Africa. Therefore, we think that doesn't really stand. Look, ultimately, they gave us a litany of reasons why colonialism is awful and the government has a duty to promote prosperity for black South Africans. We think that's a true claim. We think that's a claim we access better than they do. That was the point of Danny's POI. That's why when they said it's not mutually exclusive, that wasn't a good enough response for them to deal with that thing, because the point is this directly counteracts all the other aims in terms of promoting prosperity. In terms of reparations on their side, perhaps, look, we're sorry that Bowen Fidelity destroyed the debating, but ultimately the important thing to note here is if you have a choice between like poverty and an abstract like identity-based reparations claim, almost every ordinary black South African would choose not living in poverty. Pretty convincing reasons. We think we should defer to that. Look, for all of those reasons, we think this will promote violence, destroy economic gains in Africa, and fundamentally set society back 50 years. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
Quite interesting that we hear from Archie's speech that they care about the principles of democracy for a very selective and small population within South Africa, but for the majority of South Africans, democracy seems to be out of the mind of closing opposition and opposition in general. What we provide for you from closing government, and the reason why we take this debate, is first a principle that is focused on the relationship between South Africans, the poorest South Africans, the most disadvantaged South Africans, and the South African government. They want to talk about the dream that Mandela set, the goals of democracy and the rainbow democracy. But we access that the most when we tell you that the real dream, the real goal that Mandela set was to decrease and deconstruct colonization. That all of the fees must fall, all of the violent protests that are happening now by the youngest generations is because that dream has been deferred, that promise has not been fulfilled. 2 points I want to talk to you about today. First, I want to talk about the principle. Second, I want to talk about economics, and I'll just integrate some of the small clash about politics within. First, I'm going to offer refutation to closing opposition. Let's go just straight down the flow. First, they talk about the systemic roots of inequality. They say that Mandela had to make concessions about for the apartheid movement because of the notion of democracy that he wanted to put in the world. Opening opposition says that it wasn't based on criminalization, it was based on understanding. Look, they have no idea about the actual political sphere of the 1994 election of Mandela. Of the decrease of apartheid. Mandela had to make concessions because at the point that he was trying to make a deal for the apartheid government and the regime to fall, white South Africans held the majority of the power in the government. There was no way you were going to be able to make those concessions on a policy of redistributing all the land. Guess what? 20 years has passed, 25 years almost. It's about time that we recognize that although they may hold economic power, majority of the political power and political parties are within for black Africans, and that there has been distance from that political concessions, and that political atmosphere that made those concessions possible and necessary is not just based on an idea of democracy, but actual political realities. The second thing that we hear from them, right, is this idea of political backlash. That this will be seen as a political move by Jacob Zuma, and that the majority of his population, like, it's racked by corruption. Look, first of all, this is an assertion similar to what we hear out of opening opposition, with no real detailed analysis of how the governmental relationships actually work to reduce corruption. We just say corruption happens. Everyone just says corruption happens. No analysis about how that actually occurs and why that's going to be influencing this particular reason when we're giving redistribution lands to the majority of South Africans as per the motion. The second thing to recognize is that who is the most upset at Jacob Zuma right now? It's young South Africans, a new generation that are not seeing the benefits of this supposed breakdown of colonization. It's individuals such as my friend who actually started the Fees Must Fall movement within South Africa at his own University of Witwatersrand, when actually you're looking at individuals saying, look, because of colonization, I have not had access to education. Now you're making me pay for it without the ability for my family to actually make these particular contributions. This is why we're getting violent protests. Literally on the comparative violence protest happens when we don't do this policy by the individuals who are the most upset, rather than white Afrikaners who, like, let's say, like, on their side of the house, let's take them out the best. How many white Afrikaners are actually militarized? How many of these individuals actually have militias that could actually take down the entire government when they're less than 20% of the population? Let's deal with that comparative. We're simply outweighing. Next, what we hear from opening opposition is like, look, this is a family farms, yeah, the whole violence, I just took care of that. Next on economics, they like tax rates, right? And like, what is the impact of tax rates? Like, we can't tax individuals as easily, sure, but we can still tax them. The second thing is to recognize that we don't understand the impacts of this. Like, okay, at the point at which you can't tax them, how much is this actually going to hurt your particular base economy? We think that to this extent that you can still tax them. Anyway, the second thing to recognize about small farms is that small agriculture is crucially important. Right now, in terms of African politics, and particularly in South Africa, there's an untapped market of agriculture that is necessary to meet growing demands of a global food, not global food, but food insecurity crisis within Africa. We tell you that small firms currently cannot compete those commercial farmers, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So, with that being said, let's go to the first on the principle. What Keith tells you specifically is that government goes deeper than what opening government tells you about identity-based politics, which was really nebulously vague. We tell you that governments, especially democracies, have a vested interest in providing equality for these citizens, especially for the most marginalized. It goes deeper than the history of colonization, but what Keith tells you about the specific policies that came about as a result of that particular colonization. What does Keith tell you, Pat? Keith talks to you about the fact that there were gear policies that prioritized neoliberalism. He talked to you about Bantu laws. He talked to you about districting zoning, which increased the relativity of disease, but also the ability for individuals to have economic access to urbanization, access to certain markets. That is something that Keith tells you about. Especially when we get out of closing opposition, that they care so much about democracy, what should we really care about? Is it simply procedural democracy and not being able to take lands? Well, I think that that's a Western conception of property rights that is tied to a particular conception of democracy that doesn't necessarily reign true for African communities, which have a more focus on communalism and a more focus on redistributive policies in the first place. Next, what they say is like, look, Zimbabwe. They never refer to Keith's analysis about the difference between Zimbabwe. It's not just about the fear of white South Africans. We think that the fear of white South Africans wasn't just because of the redistributive policies, but it was because of the fact that Zimbabwe had an overwhelming amount of power. He was a dictator, had neo-patrimonialism networks that they really don't deal with. I guess Danny will try to like whip it out of the way. So with that being said, the principle that we provide you is more important than what we're hearing on opening government. Opening opposition, yeah, you don't have a chance to respond, but you also don't provide a principle justification for your side. You still don't do with the principle for opening government well. So with that being said, we're seeing how we're over the top at. Next, we have to recognize that from back half, they're not dealing with the principled analysis very well. They say that it's outcomes-based, but we recognize that it's outcomes-based, and we think that we provide those outcomes. We're going to get to economics. Yes, back half.
Sure. So you ask why tax money is important. It's important to fund public schools for black South Africans.
Sure, it's fun, yeah, and we can definitely do that, but we think that within the communities, when they have the capital, they can fund those schools as well. And also, like, you just have to give more analysis about why it's harder to tax. Like, yes, it's harder to tax, but we think that we can tax these individuals and also offer levies and just government subsidies to provide for education. Like, just please deal with competitive. Next, on economics. So what we're getting out of opening opposition is just a bunch of assertions about capital flight. We think that South Africa has an enormous economic boom, and that will always outweigh, in terms of the individual's incentive to consent or to go within the country and invest, rather than on the comparative non-investing. But the crucial thing to recognize here is that the agricultural industry is crucially important for them to work on right now. What we tell you is that when we redistribute this land, we do a couple of things. First, we allow for small-scale farming, which deals with a localized distribution of food, which is always going to outweigh on the comparative in terms of providing essential needs and goods for individuals on a localized level than rather with commercial farms, and we get no analysis about why commercial farms might be better in this particular instance. The second thing that we tell you is that it helps individuals create small businesses. So this goes deeper than what opening government is telling you about individuals' ability to do so, because we tell you that the ability to have land is crucial for being able to start a small business and advocate for things such as government subsidies, which is necessary for you to be able to increase innovation and crucial for growing the middle class, which is necessary for bringing up purchasing power levels and the GDP of the entire country. We're exceptionally proud of us.
Thank you, Governor Wood, for the speech. You now call upon the op whip to close out this debate.
Three things in this speech. First, dealing with the principal material. Archie already stole my joke about why Bo and Finelli ruined debate, but just gonna claim credit for it. Second, economics, why it's incredibly important to have a tax base, why they ruin it, and the answer of just tax them doesn't really work. Third, violence, why we give you structural analysis for why this is likely to cause conflict. So, in terms of the reparations principle, we say that what matters is not reparations for reparations' sake, but what the consequences of this policy are. Why? Because circumstances change between the original taking and the point of giving it back. This is the analysis about the watch that I asked opening government. That if I take your watch because I think it looks nice, but then suddenly we discover that this watch is carcinogenic, I shouldn't give it back to you because I shouldn't repair that with cancer. And the reason this doesn't make sense is not because I'm trying to be benevolent or whatever, just because the circumstances of policies change such that undoing something 100 years ago doesn't actually mean you create a meaningful improvement in respecting the rights of the people that you've systematically demonized. That deals with both opening and closing government, because opening government is just, well, we took stuff so we should give it back, and closing government is, well, the government harmed them so it shouldn't harm them. So that matters because all they get is tokenistic reparations, not meaningful reparations. The second response that actually deals with both of them is that there are many facets of racial colonialism. Yes, we took land, but we also engaged in residential segregation. We killed lots of people. There are lots of, I shouldn't say we, Archie, did all these actual harms that committed these forms of violence. The implication of this is, some of those things are impossible to undo, especially death. You can't unkill someone. So instead of just trying to untick all the boxes, what you should be doing is figuring, given that range of circumstances, what is the best new set of circumstances to actually do that. OG definitely didn't do that. CG kind of does it with this idea that land provides meaningful recourse. So what is our response to that? We say that is only true under certain circumstances, that capital doesn't always magically beget capital. It only does so when you can put that towards efficient uses and be supported by a broad-based growing economy. That's why Archie and I's material about the economics is so important, and I guess opening opposition too. I'll throw them a favor. The second thing, though, is that it doesn't work as recourse if you don't have stable access to that land in the first place. So if it's always under threat by things like violence, or your very life is in danger, then it also doesn't mean you actually get meaningful recourse on their side of the house. It is clear the government did bad things. It is not clear why this is the policy to deal with those things. Second thing in this speech is economics. We told you 3 arguments for why you destroy the South African tax base, and why this is particularly important, because unlike the government whip assertion that South Africa is on the verge of an economic boom, they recently had to cut interest rates because they are always like fearing the next recession, and particularly because their tax base is shrinking, so we need as much capital as money as possible. 3 reasons they get rid of that. First, the value of the capital goes down. That's because you have things like a bunch of loans that companies make based on the assumption they have this land. If they no longer have that land, the value goes down, like less capital gains taxes. Second thing is the marginal rate. Corporations are richer than the poor black farmers you're giving this to. It is much easier to tax a corporation at 40% than it is to tax someone who can barely grow enough vegetables to feed his family. We think that that is particularly problematic on their side of the house, and why their answer of just tax them doesn't work, because it is economically impossible and not desirable to just tax them at the same amounts of rates. The third answer for why you can't just tax them is the political incentives. Like, 2 things here. First is just that Zuma relies on his base, so he's not going to tax his base, because once the base falls out, he loses all political support and won't be able to win the next vote of confidence. But the second thing is exactly what they tell you. If they say that, like, young black people are so angry that they're like rioting for things like university fees, how are they going to respond to just taxing them and like the government trying to take away their resources? It's the exact political backlash the government's scared of. What does this mean? A lot less money. That means less money to do things like subsidize university fees, solving the violent retaliation argument we heard from closing government. It means a lot less money to do things like provide welfare to poor people to make sure they get access to resources. A lot less money to support things like education subsidies under the Black Economic Empowerment Program that are aimed at giving social mobility to the people victimized by colonialism in the past. We actually get those benefits on our side of the house because you can actually help these people. Sure, I'll take one.
So I've still not heard an actual reason for why this, first of all, this cannot happen, or the tax cannot happen on the comparative. But why does that outweigh, even if we take you at your best, the actual growing food insecurity within the nation and the ability for small farmers to localize that distribution?
Yeah, I'll answer food security in a second. In terms of the comparative, it is because it is comparatively easier to tax people who are richer and less politically important to your base than people who are not. When you like shift the land to them, it becomes harder to tax that land. So, in terms of pragmatics, I answered the OG argument about capital begets capital that only works under certain circumstances, like a supportive government, to actually help economic growth. In terms of closing government, they talk about small-scale farmers. A couple reasons this doesn't actually work. First is economies of scale. When you own like much more land, you're able to do things like distribute water more efficiently, which cuts production costs and keeps food inexpensive so that poor people can actually get access to it and feed themselves. The second thing is that when you try to have a bunch of small farmers with their own individual farms, it means they do things like engage in subsistence farming instead of farming that can be profitable. So you never get like some reasonable degree of cash crops on their side of the house, which can actually go up in value and extend, like put capital into these regions. Instead, you just have everyone growing a couple of vegetables for themselves, which is problematic because it means you never get things like productivity growth or capital appreciation on their side of the house. It actually leads to not just like economic subsistence, but economic growth, meaning you don't meaningfully help the lives of these people who've been trapped in poverty because of colonialism. Last thing is violence. Yeah. We give you 3 key factors for when people are likely to turn to violence. 1, they lose faith in the political system's ability to resolve the conflict, so they take matters into their own hands. 2nd, they have less to lose from violence than the status quo. And 3rd, they see their opposition as less than human. All of those apply in this context with this policy. In terms of the political system, we told you that the Zuma government is increasingly losing, people are increasingly losing confidence in it. They think he has failed on the promises of the ANC, that he's just trying to rally around his bases, and that's why he's barely surviving each vote of confidence. We're not just asserting corruption's happening, we're talking about the political situation of South Africa. Then they say that young blacks are the people we need to care about. So, 1, the government has already worked to address these problems by doing things like reducing fees or expanding black economic empowerment and engaging in these policies. Not only do they make that harder by cutting the tax base to fund those policies, but also we say they don't do anything to address the Afrikaners who are mobilized on their side of the house have access to weapons. They say Mandela 25 years ago had to make these concessions, but we say given the economic resources they have, the fact that they're still armed, the fact that they still occupy this land means you don't meaningfully solve that problem. Why do they have less to lose from the violence? Because we tell you that given that like your land is often all you have everything to lose from this policy, which means you're much more likely to engage in violence to defend it. The last thing is we tell you these are Afrikaners who have for the past 600 years been told that black people are less than human, which means they're likely to engage in this violence. This kills many, many people, and in terms of like the short-term harm, you can't undo the effects of death, and that also creates much more violence that scares out companies. We say for those reasons it creates an act of harm we're proud to oppose.
And invite all sides to shake hands.